Washington, D.C., January 12, 1848. A first-term congressman from Illinois stood up in the House of Representatives. He was 38 years old. He had been in office for barely a year. He had no particular national reputation, no powerful allies, no reason to make enemies unnecessarily. He made enemies anyway. His name was Abraham Lincoln, and the question he was about to ask was this: on what exact spot of American soil did the first American blood get shed? The war with Mexico had already been going on for nearly 2 years. American armies had won battle after battle. American soldiers had fought their way through desert and mountain and city street all the way to the Mexican capital. General Winfield Scott had marched through the gates of Mexico City in September 1847. The war was, by any measure, an American military triumph. And Lincoln stood up and said, "Show me the spot." He was referring to the incident that President James K. Polk had used to justify the war. The story went like this. On April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry had crossed the Rio Grande and attacked an American patrol. 11 Americans had been killed. 49 had been captured. American blood had been shed on American soil. Congress had voted for war 16 days later. Lincoln's question, his spot resolutions as they became known, was devastatingly simple. If the blood had been shed on American soil, then show everyone the exact spot. Mark it on a map. Prove it was American. Because Lincoln had done his reading, he knew that the patrol had been operating between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, and he knew that the strip of land between those two rivers, the roughly 150 miles of brush country where Captain Seth Thornton's dragoons had ridden and been ambushed, had never been unambiguously American. It had been claimed by Texas. It had been disputed by Mexico. Whether it was actually American soil was, to put it generously, a legal question. Polk's war message to Congress had been very careful. He had said American blood had been shed on American soil. He had never quite specified which soil was American. Stay with us, because what Lincoln was pointing at, this gap between what the president said and what was actually true, is the story of this entire video. And it begins not with a battle, but with a map and a plan, and one president who had already decided what he was going to do before any incident gave him the excuse.
This is video 29 of the Nostalgia History Mexican-American War series. We've been here for 2 videos now, building the foundation: the Alamo, the Texas Revolution, the chaotic decade of the Lone Star Republic, the annexation. Now we arrive at the moment the war actually starts. But this video is not about the first battle. The first battle comes in video 30. This video is about the decision, the calculation, the manufactured provocation, and the Americans, some famous, some entirely forgotten, who looked at what their president was doing and said, "This is wrong." Let's start with the geography, because the geography is the whole story. 2 rivers and the land between them. Texas, as the Republic of Texas had claimed it, stretched to the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande was the southwestern and southern boundary that Texas insisted upon, based on, and this is important, a treaty that Santa Anna had signed as a prisoner of war that the Mexican government had never ratified and that most international legal scholars of the era considered of dubious validity. Mexico's position was different. Mexico said the southern boundary of what had formerly been the Mexican state of Coahuila y Texas was the Nueces River, a smaller river about 150 miles north and east of the Rio Grande. The territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, in Mexico's view, had never been part of the rebellious Texan province. It was Mexican territory, full stop. Who was right? In strict legal terms, the question was genuinely unsettled. The Nueces Strip, as historians call the contested zone, had been a de facto no-man's land for years. The population was sparse, both sides had claims, neither had exercised clear, uncontested administrative control. Polk knew this. His own Secretary of State, James Buchanan, later to become president himself, had privately expressed reservations about the strength of America's legal claim to the Rio Grande boundary. The documentation in Polk's own diary makes it clear he was aware of the ambiguity. He chose to assert the Rio Grande boundary anyway, loudly, clearly, and backed by troops. General Taylor's uncomfortable advance. In January 1846, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to move his army from Corpus Christi, on the Texas side of the Nueces River, south to the Rio Grande. Taylor was a professional soldier of long experience and genuine distinction. He was not a political man in any deep sense, but he was not naive. He understood what he was being asked to do. He was being asked to march his army into disputed territory, set up camp on the banks of the Rio Grande directly across from the Mexican town of Matamoros, and present the Mexican army with a provocation. Taylor wrote to his superiors in Washington expressing discomfort. The advance was, he noted, likely to produce an armed response from Mexico. He wanted clarity about his orders. He received clarity. The orders stood. Move to the Rio Grande. Taylor moved. He established a fortified position which would become known as Fort Texas, directly across the river from Matamoros. He positioned his artillery to command the town. From Matamoros, Mexican General Mariano Arista watched through a telescope and sent messages to Mexico City. The Americans are building a fort on our territory. We need guidance. Both sides were now waiting. Polk's diary, the most damning document. We know what Polk was thinking during this period because Polk kept a meticulous diary, and his diary, which historians have had access to for decades, is one of the most revealing documents in American political history. On May 9, 1846, the day before he received news of the Thornton Affair, the ambush of the American patrol that he would use as his war justification, Polk wrote in his diary that he had decided to send a war message to Congress, regardless of whether any incident had occurred. Read that again. The President of the United States had decided to ask Congress for a declaration of war before he had received any news of an attack on American troops. He was going to ask for war based on Mexico's refusal to repay certain debts and on the general state of diplomatic relations between the two countries. The Thornton Affair, which arrived as news the following day, was a gift. It transformed a politically difficult war message based on financial grievances into an emotionally compelling war message based on American blood and American soil. Polk rewrote his message to lead with the attack. He had already decided to go to war. The ambush just gave him a better story to tell. In a few minutes, we'll read you the exact words from Polk's diary, written the day before the attack, where he describes planning his war message. This is not a historian's interpretation. This is Polk himself in his own handwriting.
Captain Seth Thornton's Patrol. Captain Seth Thornton was a career cavalry officer, 33 years old, a Virginian by birth, who had served in the Army since graduating from West Point. On April 24, 1846, he was ordered to take a patrol of approximately 70 dragoons south of the Rio Grande into the disputed Nueces Strip to scout for Mexican forces. The patrol moved out the next morning, April 25th. They were operating in territory that Taylor's office knew was contested. The Rancho de Cadicitos, where Thornton led his men, was south of the Rio Grande on land that the Mexican government considered unambiguously Mexican. The patrol was surrounded by a significantly larger Mexican cavalry force. In the ensuing fight, which lasted only a few minutes before the Americans were overwhelmed, 11 American soldiers were killed and 49 were captured. Thornton himself was taken prisoner. Some soldiers escaped and made it back to Taylor's camp to report what had happened. Taylor sent an urgent dispatch to Washington. Hostilities may now be considered as commenced. Polk's war message, the careful wording. Polk received Taylor's dispatch on the evening of May 9th, the same day he had written in his diary about planning a war message without a pretext. The dispatch changed everything, politically speaking. It was now much easier. 2 days later, on May 11th, Polk sent his war message to Congress. It is worth examining the language precisely because it is a masterpiece of deliberate ambiguity. Polk said that Mexico had passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil. Note what he did not say. He did not say which specific soil. He did not mark the spot on a map. He did not acknowledge the legal dispute over the Nueces Strip. He asserted the Rio Grande boundary as settled fact, and then described what happened when Mexican forces operated south of it. He was not, technically, lying. He was choosing a version of the facts and presenting it as if no other version existed. Congress debated for 2 days. The vote was 174-14 in the House, 40-2 in the Senate. The United States declared war on Mexico on May 13, 1846. The men who voted no. 14 members of the House of Representatives voted against the war declaration. 2 senators voted no. Their names deserve to be remembered because voting no in that chamber on that day required genuine courage. The political atmosphere was electric with patriotism and outrage. American soldiers were dead.
The newspapers were full of the attack. Anyone who voted against the war could expect to be called a traitor, a coward, a friend of Mexico. In some districts, voting no would be a political death sentence. They voted no anyway.
John Quincy Adams, former president, then serving as a congressman from Massachusetts at the age of 78, was among them. He had opposed the annexation of Texas from the beginning, seeing it clearly as a slave state expansion project. He saw the war with the same clarity. He would die in the House chamber 2 years later, still serving, still opposing what he regarded as a war of conquest. Joshua Giddings of Ohio, Columbus Delano of Ohio, Amos Tuck of New Hampshire, Garrett Davis of Kentucky, who argued from the floor that the war had begun unconstitutionally, that the president had deliberately moved troops into disputed territory to provoke exactly the response he received. They were a small minority. They were, historically speaking, correct. Captain Seth Thornton, the man whose ambush started a war. He was captured at the Rancho de Caricitos, eventually exchanged and returned to service. He was killed at the Battle of San Pascual in California in December 1846, dying in the war that his patrol's ambush had triggered. History remembers the incident. It rarely remembers the man. John Quincy Adams, former president, congressman, lifelong anti-slavery advocate. At 78 years old, he voted against the war declaration and continued to oppose the war until his death. He collapsed on the floor of the House chamber in February 1848 and died 2 days later, still in service. He called the Mexican-American War a war of conquest from the beginning, and he was not wrong. Opposition to the Mexican-American War was not marginal or fringe. It came from former presidents, major poets, the most celebrated essayist of the era, and a young congressman who would one day be the most important president in American history. It was not enough to stop the war, but it was real, and it matters. Henry David Thoreau, Jail and Civil Disobedience. Henry David Thoreau was 30 years old when the Mexican-American War began. He was a naturalist, a writer, a transcendentalist philosopher living in Concord, Massachusetts. He was not a political activist in any conventional sense. He did not go to rallies or give speeches. He refused to pay his poll tax. The poll tax was a state tax, not a federal tax technically, but Thoreau refused to pay it as a protest against both slavery and the Mexican-American War. He viewed the war as a slaveholders' project designed to expand slavery into the conquered territories. He wanted no part of it. If his tax money was going to fund a war of conquest and the expansion of slavery, he would not pay. He was arrested in the summer of 1846 and spent a night in the Concord jail. The story goes that Ralph Waldo Emerson, his neighbor and friend and intellectual mentor, visited him and asked, "Henry, why are you in there?" And Thoreau replied, "Ralph, why are you not in here?" Whether the story is precisely accurate or somewhat embellished by the retelling, the sentiment is real. Thoreau believed that in the face of an unjust government action, the morally correct response was not compliance, but resistance. He was released from jail the next morning, reportedly because his aunt paid the tax on his behalf without his permission. He was furious. 2 years later, he wrote an essay about the experience. He originally titled it Resistance to Civil Government. It was later published under the title Civil Disobedience. It became one of the most influential political essays in the history of democratic thought. Mahatma Gandhi read it and cited it as a foundational influence on his campaigns of nonviolent resistance in South Africa and India. Martin Luther King Jr. read it and cited it as a moral framework for the American civil rights movement. One night in a Massachusetts jail, over a war most Americans no longer remember, produced an essay that shaped the conscience of the 20th century. Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. Henry David Thoreau, Civil Disobedience, 1849. Ralph Waldo Emerson, The Arsenic Prophecy. Ralph Waldo Emerson was the most celebrated American intellectual of his era. His essays, his lectures, his philosophy of self-reliance and transcendentalism shaped how educated Americans thought about themselves and their country. When the war with Mexico was declared, Emerson made a prediction that turned out to be one of the most prophetic statements in American political history. He wrote in his journal, "The United States will conquer Mexico, but
but it will be as the man swallows the arsenic, which brings him down in turn. He was right. And not in some vague metaphorical sense. He was precisely right. The territory that the United States would take from Mexico would reopen with volcanic force the question of whether slavery would be permitted in the new lands. That question, the Wilmot Proviso debate, the compromise of 50-50, bleeding Kansas, the collapse of the Whig Party, the rise of the Republican Party, the election of Lincoln, secession, would destroy the political stability that American leaders had been trying to maintain for 30 years. The Mexican-American War was the arsenic. The Civil War was the coming down. Emerson did not stop at prophecy. He spoke at anti-war rallies. He wrote essays criticizing the war. He used his enormous intellectual authority to give the opposition movement legitimacy.
The United States will conquer Mexico, but it will be as the man swallows the arsenic, which brings him down in turn. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Journal, 1847. Frederick Douglass, The War as Slaveholders' Conspiracy. Frederick Douglass had escaped slavery in Maryland in 1838. By 1846, he was the most prominent African-American intellectual and activist in the United States, a writer, orator, and abolitionist of extraordinary power, whose autobiography had been published the previous year and had already become one of the most widely read books in America. Douglass saw the Mexican-American War with a clarity that most white Americans, even those who opposed it, could not fully match. He understood it not as a diplomatic miscalculation or a presidential overreach, but as a deliberate project of the slaveholding class, designed to add new territories to the Union where slavery would be planted and expanded. He wrote in his newspaper, The North Star, "This is a war of conquest, a war to rob Mexico of her territory." He connected it directly to the question that consumed his entire life's work, the survival and expansion of American slavery. The war's real purpose, Douglass argued, was not national honor or manifest destiny or Polk's stated goals. It was territory for slavery to grow into. He was right. The moment the war ended and the territory was transferred, the question of slavery in the new lands exploded American politics in exactly the way Douglass had predicted. Douglass's opposition to the war cost him something concrete. The climate of wartime patriotism made abolitionist voices even more easily dismissed as unpatriotic and extreme. He continued anyway. He always continued anyway. Abraham Lincoln, The Spot Resolutions. We met Lincoln at the opening of this video. Let's go deeper. Lincoln had arrived in Congress in December 1847, elected as a Whig from an Illinois district that had been represented by the same Whig for years. He was on record as opposing the war before he arrived, but he was also a practical politician who understood that his party had put itself in a complicated position. They were supporting the troops while criticizing the president who had sent them. This was not an incoherent position. It is possible to support soldiers while opposing the political decision that put them in danger, but it was politically treacherous, and both sides knew it. Lincoln introduced his spot resolutions on December 22, 1847. He demanded that the President of the United States specify the precise spot of territory where American blood had been shed and prove that it was, in fact, American. He followed up with a speech on January 12, 1848. It was one of the most penetrating pieces of political analysis delivered in Congress during the entire era. He argued that Polk had deliberately moved troops into disputed territory, knowing that Mexico would respond, knowing that American soldiers would be killed, and that the whole sequence had been engineered to manufacture a pretext for a war that Polk had already decided to fight.
He used the word imbecility to describe Polk's justifications. He used the phrase high-handed and monstrous injustice. He was a first-term congressman, and he was saying this about a sitting wartime president whose war had been wildly popular. The political cost was immediate. Illinois newspapers attacked him. His constituents were outraged. His party partner in the district wrote to him privately urging him to stop. Lincoln's law partner William Herndon, back in Springfield, wrote that the speech had hurt you very much back home. Lincoln did not run for re-election. He returned to Springfield and spent the next several years in private practice, largely out of politics. The man who would one day save the Union was for a time politically finished, in part because he had stood up and told the truth about an unjust war. Henry Clay, the war and the son it killed. Henry Clay was, in 1846, one of the most revered and most exhausted men in American politics. He had served in Congress as Secretary of State and had run for president 3 times. He was the architect of the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1833.
We have spent 3 sections inside the American debate over this war. We have heard from the president who made it happen, the Congress that authorized it, the dissenters who said it was wrong. Now we turn to the other side of the river. Because there is a fundamental asymmetry in how this war has been remembered. American school children learn about Manifest Destiny and the Mexican Cession. Mexican school children learn about La Intervención Americana, the American intervention. These are not just different names, they are different understandings of what happened. Mexico in 1846, a nation in crisis. Mexico in 1846 was 25 years old as an independent nation. It had won its independence from Spain in 1821 after a decade of brutal conflict. And in those 25 years, it had experienced 36 changes of government. That is not a misprint. 36 governments in 25 years. Constitutions written, suspended, rewritten. Generals who became presidents becoming generals again. Santa Anna alone served as president 11 times. The country was politically unstable in ways that defy easy description. But political instability does not mean national illegitimacy. Mexico was a sovereign nation with recognized borders under international law. It had a functioning legal system, a professional military, established diplomatic relationships with European powers, and a population of approximately 7 million people. And from Mexico's perspective, what was happening in 1846 was not ambiguous. The United States had annexed a province that Mexico considered its own rebellious territory. The United States had then stationed troops on land that Mexico considered unambiguously Mexican. And now the United States was using a military incident in that disputed zone as justification for a war of conquest. The Mexican government's legal case was, if anything, stronger than the American case. The Nueces River as the boundary of Texas had more historical and legal support than the Rio Grande claim. The treaty Santa Anna had signed were, by any reasonable legal analysis, invalid agreements made under duress. Mexico had not declared war on the United States. The United States had declared war on Mexico. Mexican public opinion, defending the homeland. Despite the country's political instability, Mexican public opinion on the war was remarkably unified. When American troops marched into Mexican territory and the war was declared, Mexicans across the political spectrum, liberals and conservatives, federalists and centralists. This was not manipulation or propaganda. It was a genuine emotional and political response to invasion. Their country was being attacked. Their territory was being taken. Whatever disagreements they had with their own government, this was not the moment for faction. Volunteers enlisted. Communities organized to support the army. Priests gave sermons framing the defense of Mexico as a religious duty against Protestant invaders. Newspapers that had been fiercely critical of the government the week before called for unity. The fact that Mexico eventually lost the war does not mean that this response was irrational or unjustified. It was the response of a nation being invaded, and it was proportionate. General Mariano Arista, the professional soldier. The Mexican commander who would face Taylor's army in the first battles of the war was General Mariano Arista. He was 42 years old, a career military officer, professionally trained in the conventional European style of warfare. Arista was not a villain. He was a professional soldier doing his job, defending his country's territory against what his government, not unreasonably, regarded as an illegal invasion. He had received intelligence about Taylor's movements and had positioned his forces accordingly. He was outnumbered in artillery quality and tactical flexibility, but he was a competent commander. When the Thornton Affair happened, when his cavalry forces surrounded and defeated the American patrol, Arista did not regard this as starting a war. He regarded it as defending Mexican territory from an American patrol that had crossed onto that territory without authorization. From his perspective, he was right. He would lose both battles at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. We'll cover those in video 30, and his career would never fully recover. He was blamed for the defeats, replaced, and eventually lived in poverty. He died in 1855, nearly broke, in Lisbon, Portugal. The soldiers Mexico sent. The Mexican army that would face Taylor's forces in 1846 was, in many ways, a mirror image of the army that had marched north to Texas in 1836. It was a conscript force, drawing primarily from the rural poor and from indigenous communities. The pay was irregular, the equipment was often old, and the logistics were chronically underfunded. But there is something important that gets lost in the American triumphalist narrative of the Mexican-American War. The Mexican soldiers who fought in this war were not defeated because they were cowardly or incompetent. They were defeated by a combination of factors: American technological advantages, particularly in artillery, American logistical superiority, and, crucially, the catastrophic political interference that prevented Mexican commanders from making sound military decisions in the field. Mexican officers who lost battles were frequently court-martialed. Officers who argued for tactical retreats that might save their forces were accused of treason. The pressure to fight, to hold positions that were militarily untenable because retreating was politically intolerable, this killed Mexican soldiers by the thousands.
They deserve to be understood as what they were: men fighting for their country against an invasion, commanded by a political system that often sacrificed their lives for pride rather than strategy. The women of Puebla, the women of Mexico City. One of the most completely erased stories of the Mexican-American War is the experience of Mexican civilians, and within that story, the experience of women is the most thoroughly erased of all. As American forces advanced through Mexico, Taylor in the north, Scott along the Gulf Coast and inland toward Mexico City, Mexican civilians were caught in the violence. Some towns collaborated with the occupying forces, some organized resistance, most tried to survive. Women organized food networks that supported guerrilla fighters resisting the occupation. Women hid men who were being sought by American soldiers. Women maintained community institutions, churches, schools, markets that kept daily life functioning under occupation. Women cared for the wounded on both sides. Their names are almost entirely lost. Mexican archives have more records of this experience than American histories acknowledge, but the systematic documentation simply was not done at the time. The stories that survive come from fragments, occasional mentions in American soldiers' letters, in Mexican newspaper accounts, in the records of priests and local officials. They were there. They mattered. And the history that omits them is a smaller, less true history than the one that finds them. General Mariano Arista, Mexican commander at the opening battles of the war, a professional soldier defending his country's territory against what his government legitimately regarded as an illegal invasion. He was blamed for the defeats at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, despite fighting under severe disadvantages, removed from command, and eventually died in poverty in Lisbon. His perspective on the war's causes, which survive in Mexican military archives, is almost entirely absent from American historical writing. We've been talking about presidents and generals and politicians, but wars are fought by privates and corporals and sergeants, young men who are usually the last to understand why they are fighting and the first to pay for it. Who were the men who actually went to Mexico? The regular army, professional soldiers. The United States Army in 1846 was tiny by the standards of what it would become. There were approximately 8,000 officers and enlisted men in the regular army, the standing professional force. In a war that would eventually require 100,000 soldiers, this was a foundation, not a fighting force. The regular army soldiers were professional volunteers, men who had enlisted for 5-year terms, who had been drilled and disciplined, who knew how to maintain weapons, construct fortifications, and operate artillery. The artillery in particular was a point of American strength that would prove decisive in the opening battles. The flying artillery, horse-drawn field guns that could redeploy rapidly during a battle, was a tactical innovation that Mexican commanders had not fully accounted for. Among the officers of the regular army in 1846, a remarkable proportion would reappear as major figures in the Civil War 15 years later. Ulysses Grant was a young lieutenant, serving as a quartermaster with Taylor's army. Robert E. Lee was an engineer captain under Scott's command, performing reconnaissance missions that became legendary. Thomas Jackson, who would become Stonewall Jackson, won his first real battle recognition at Chapultepec. George McClellan, P.G.T. Beauregard, James Longstreet, George Meade,
They were young men learning their trade in Mexico. The lessons they learned would be applied with lethal efficiency against each other. The volunteers, enthusiasm and chaos. To fight a war requiring 100,000 soldiers with an 8,000-man regular army, the United States relied on volunteers. Congress authorized the president to call for 50,000 volunteers, and men answered in numbers that far exceeded the available equipment and organization. The volunteers were, broadly speaking, enthusiastic, undisciplined, and motivated by a mixture of patriotism, adventure, economic desperation, and the promise of land bounties at the end of their service. The land bounty, 160 acres of public land, or cash equivalent for veterans, was a significant incentive in an era when land was the primary form of wealth. Many of the volunteers were young men from the American South and Midwest with no particular military experience. They had not been drilled. They did not understand military hierarchy. They resented officers who expected them to follow orders automatically. They were brave under fire in ways that sometimes surprised even the professional soldiers alongside them. They were also capable of atrocities against Mexican civilians that became one of the war's darkest stains. Taylor himself wrote, with visible frustration, about the behavior of some volunteer units toward Mexican civilians. Murders, rapes, looting. Taylor tried to impose discipline, issued orders, court-martialed individuals when he could. The violence continued. The immigrant soldiers fighting for their new country. Among the most important and most overlooked groups in the Union Army were the immigrant soldiers, men who had arrived in the United States recently, often fleeing poverty or political persecution in Europe, and who had joined the army because it was the best available employment. The Irish were the largest single group. The Great Famine had begun in 1845, and Irish immigrants were arriving in American port cities at a rate of hundreds of thousands per year. They were desperately poor. They faced intense discrimination. No Irish need apply signs were common in American cities. The army did not discriminate on national origin, and it paid, so Irish men enlisted. What happened to some of those Irish soldiers in Mexico, why some of them crossed the river and joined the other side, is the story of the San Patricio Battalion. We will tell that story in full in video 33. But for now, it is worth understanding who the immigrant soldiers were and why they were there. Not out of passionate patriotism, in most cases, but out of economic necessity. German immigrants recently arrived after the failed revolutions of 1848, Scottish and English immigrants, men who spoke broken English and were marching into a country where they could not speak the language at all, fighting for a republic that had not yet decided whether to accept them as full citizens. What soldiers were told. The propaganda of the Mexican-American War deserves its own examination because it shaped what ordinary soldiers believed they were fighting for. The Mexican people were described in American popular press as backward, degraded, incapable of self-governance. The standard racist vocabulary of the era applied to a Catholic, Spanish-speaking, mixed-race population that Anglo-American culture regarded with deep suspicion. Some of the more extreme voices argued that Mexico's people were unfit for civilization and that American conquest would be an act of benevolence. The land itself was described as magnificent, fertile valleys, rich mineral deposits, access to Pacific ports. The opportunity for American expansion was presented as obvious, natural, and deserved. Young men who enlisted heard about glory, about the chance to prove themselves, about land and adventure and the great southward expansion of American civilization. Very few of them were told about the hospitals without anesthesia, the dysentery and yellow fever that would kill more American soldiers than Mexican bullets, or the moral questions about what they were doing there. The men who asked those moral questions tended not to be the ones sending the recruitment posters. Ulysses S. Grant, Lieutenant, 4th Infantry. Serving as a regimental quartermaster under Taylor, Grant had already shown the capacity for observation and analysis that would define his Civil War command. He wrote in his memoirs that he believed the Mexican-American War was one of the most unjust wars ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker one. He served anyway. He carried that moral unease with him for the rest of his life. His memoirs' account of the Mexican-American War is one of the most honest pieces of military self-examination in American literature. James K. Polk is one of the most consequential presidents in American history. He is also one of the least celebrated. Part of this is because his presidency does not lend itself to easy heroism. What he did was effective, but the methods were questionable, and the consequences were catastrophic in ways he never lived to see. But to understand the Mexican-American War, you have to understand what Polk was actually trying to accomplish, because the war was not ultimately about the disputed strig of land between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. It was about something much larger. The Four Goals, Revisited. In video 28, we described Polk's four goals: the settlement of the Oregon question with Britain, the annexation of Texas, the acquisition of California from Mexico, and the reduction of the tariff. He was specific about all four before his term began, and he pursued all four with relentless focus. But the California goal deserves particular attention because it was the real prize, and it was the goal that required a war. Polk had tried to buy California. In the fall of 1845, he had sent an envoy to Mexico City, John Slidell of Louisiana, with an offer. The United States would pay Mexico $25 million for California and New Mexico, and would assume all outstanding claims by American citizens against Mexico in exchange. The Mexican government refused to even meet with Slidell. They regarded the very existence of the mission as an insult, a negotiation about territory that Mexico did not regard as being available for sale, conducted by a country that had just illegally annexed Texas. The political climate in Mexico made any accommodation with the United States radioactively unpopular. No Mexican government could have accepted the Slidell mission's terms and survived. Polk noted in his diary that the Mexican refusal to negotiate justified stronger measures. He had already ordered Taylor to the Rio Grande before Slidell left for Mexico. The diplomatic mission and the military provocation were running simultaneously. If diplomacy worked, he would buy California. If it didn't work, he would take it. The three-front strategy. Polk's war plan was, in strategic terms, genuinely audacious. He was planning not one campaign, but three simultaneously against a country whose territory stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific. Taylor in the north. Drive into northeastern Mexico, defeat the Mexican army in the field, and capture the industrial and population centers of northern Mexico. This would demonstrate American military superiority and demoralize Mexico's government. Kearny in the west. Colonel Stephen Kearny would lead a force from Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, march across the desert to New Mexico, take Santa Fe, and then continue to California. This would seize the western territories before Mexico could organize their defense. Scott from the sea. General Winfield Scott would eventually lead an amphibious force to Veracruz on Mexico's Gulf Coast, and from there march 200 miles inland to Mexico City itself, replicating, in a sense, Hernando Cortez's route of 1519. If Mexico could not be brought to terms by Taylor's northern campaign, Scott would bring the war to the capital. This was a war of continental conquest, planned with meticulous care before the first shots were fired. The incident on the Rio Grande was the trigger. The plan had been drawn long before. The moral calculation. There is a version of this history that focuses on Polk's effectiveness, the four goals achieved, the continent secured, the Pacific ports obtained, and presents him as a successful, if hard-nosed, statesman. There is another version that focuses on what was required to achieve those goals: the manufactured provocation, the 12,000 Mexicans killed, the civilian suffering, the displacement of the California and Nuevo Mexicano populations who were legally promised protection by the treaty and received almost none of it. Both versions are true. The effectiveness was real. The cost was also real. Grant's words in his memoir are worth returning to. I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. I thought so at the time, when I was a youngster, only I had not moral courage enough to resign. I considered my unhappy fate in being at that time in the army. A man who would command Union armies in the Civil War, who would become President of the United States, who is celebrated on the $50 bill. That man said in his own memoir that he had participated in what he knew to be a wicked war because he lacked the moral courage to resign. That honesty is remarkable, and it deserves to be taken seriously. The presidents and generals and congressmen have been speaking. Let's hear from some other people. Private Daniel Harvey Hill, U.S. Army. Daniel Harvey Hill was 24 years old when the Mexican-American War began. He was a graduate of West Point, class of 1842, assigned as a lieutenant to the 1st Artillery Regiment. He would go on to distinguish himself in multiple battles of the Mexican-American War and later become a Confederate general in the Civil War. But in 1846, he was a young officer who had just arrived in Texas with Taylor's army, and he wrote letters home to his family in South Carolina that give one of the most vivid ground-level accounts of what the army's advance felt like from inside. He wrote about the landscape, the strange, flat brush country of South Texas, so unlike the Carolina Piedmont he had grown up in. He wrote about the heat, the dust, the insects, and the water that made men sick. He wrote about his fellow soldiers with a mixture of affection and exasperation. And he wrote about his moral unease, not about the war itself necessarily. Hill was a man of his time and place, and the war felt justified to him in ways it didn't to Lincoln or Thoreau, but about specific things he saw. Volunteers who treated Mexican civilians violently, the gap between the proclaimed ideals of the mission and the practical reality on the ground. His letters are in a Southern archive. They have been studied by historians, but never made it into popular tellings of the war. He was a minor figure who became significant. But in 1846, he was just a young man watching history begin. Rosa Morales, Matamoros. We know her name from a single Mexican newspaper reference from June 1846. She was a laundress in Matamoros, on the Mexican side of the Rio Grande, directly across from Taylor's army and Fort Texas. When the American artillery began shelling Matamoros, a bombardment intended to suppress Mexican fire and demonstrate American strength, Rosa Morales' neighborhood was hit. Her home and the homes of her neighbors were damaged. Civilians were killed in the bombardment, an accounting that most American histories do not include in their casualty totals. The Mexican newspaper that mentioned her name was describing the civilian casualties. It was arguing that the American bombardment of a civilian city was a war crime under the laws of nations. Rosa Morales had not declared war on anyone. She had not voted for Santa Anna or Polk or any other political figure. She had been doing laundry in the city where she lived when the war came to her street. We do not know if she survived. We know she was there. José María Tornel y Mendeville. Tornel was Mexico's Secretary of War at the beginning of the conflict. He is a complex figure. He had served Santa Anna and various Mexican governments for years, sometimes competently, sometimes disastrously. What makes him worth naming here is a document he wrote in 1837, 9 years before the war, in which he predicted almost exactly what would happen. He warned that the United States pattern of supporting American settlers in foreign territory, then recognizing their rebellions, then annexing them, would eventually be used against all of Mexico. Texas first, he wrote, then the rest.
He was right. Nobody listened. The political dysfunction of Mexican governance made it impossible to act on even accurate prophetic analysis. The warning was written. The invasion came anyway. He died in 1853, having lived to see everything he warned about come true. The 14 Congressmen. We named them earlier, the 14 members of the House who voted against the war declaration on May 13, 1846. They are worth naming again because they made a choice that cost them politically, and because they were right. John Quincy Adams, Joshua Giddings, Joseph Grinnell, Amos Tuck, Garrett Davis, Columbus Delano, Joseph Root, Daniel King, William Darrah, Luther Severance, John Rockwell, George Fries, Rodolphus Dickinson, George Rathbun. 14 names. They voted no when voting no meant being called a traitor to your country in a time of war. History vindicated them, but vindication came slowly, and for most of them it came too late to matter politically. The war was declared. Taylor's army was already on the move. General Arista's forces were moving to intercept him. Two armies, each believing it was operating on its own territory, about to collide on the flat brush country of South Texas. We've spent 3 videos now building to this moment. The Alamo, the chaotic decade of the Lone Star Republic, the annexation, the manufactured provocation, the men who said this was wrong. Now comes the war itself. And the first thing to understand about this war, before we get to the battles, before we get to the sieges and the marches and the final entry into Mexico City, is this. The men who fought it were not the men who chose it. The men who chose it were in Washington, making calculations about California and tariffs and the balance of slave states in the Senate.
The men who fought it were 20-year-old privates from Ohio and Tennessee and County Cork and the barrios of Monterrey, who were about to discover what artillery and disease and close-quarters combat actually feel like. Ulysses Grant was one of them. He already knew this was wrong. He went anyway. He would carry that knowledge for the rest of his life. In video 30, we go to Palo Alto and the Resaca de la Palma, the first two battles of the war. We'll tell you exactly what happened on May 8th and 9th, 1846. We'll introduce you to the soldiers on both sides, their names, their backgrounds, what they were thinking in the hours before the fighting started. And we'll show you how a technological advantage in artillery, combined with a Mexican command structure undermined by political interference, produced one of the most one-sided military results of the entire war. Taylor had won 2 battles, but winning battles in South Texas wasn't winning the war. Mexico hadn't surrendered. Mexico wasn't going to surrender. To end this war, America would have to march all the way to Mexico City and fight for every mile of it. Thank you for watching Nostalgia History. If this series is changing how you understand the story of the Mexican-American War, if you're seeing something in this history that you were never taught, subscribe, share, and leave a comment. Tell us which voice from this video stayed with you. Was it Lincoln demanding to see the spot? Thoreau in his jail cell asking why Emerson wasn't in there with him? Grant in his memoirs, decades later, calling it wicked? Rosa Morales doing laundry when the shells started falling? This war was chosen. These people didn't choose it. Remember that when we get to the battles.